In the year 865 AD, inside the quiet, rugged walls of a Danish longhouse, the wind outside howled as a messenger spoke of unimaginable treachery. The brothers sat at a table, their faces cold and unreadable. But there was a tension so thick, it clung to the air like smoke, and in that silence, the chaos began. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, for brothers bound by blood, bound by revenge, heard the news of their father's brutal death. But there was no weeping, there was no shouting, there was only the sound of knives. Sigurd Snaken, the eye, his face as grim as the frost outside, held a small blade, his hands steady despite the turmoil within. He sliced his fingernail, slowly, methodically. The blade cut deeper, through skin, past flesh, and into the bone, yet he didn't flinch. There was no pain. The murder of his father, the humiliation of Ragnar, had numbed him beyond all feeling. Across the table, Bjorn Ironside, the fiercest of them all, gripped a carved chest piece in his hand. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from a rage so intense that the bone shattered in his palm. Blood dripped from his fingers, but he didn't even notice. He didn't speak. It wasn't grief they felt. It was a brutal, unrelenting rage. The brothers didn't speak, but their bodies moved in unison. This was not a moment of mourning. It was the moment that ignited a war that would forever change the land they called home. The message was clear. The death of Ragnar was not the end. It was the beginning of a storm that would wash over England in a fury of fire and blood. The Viking world began to stir. Word spread. The drums of war began to beat. The great heathen army, an unstoppable force, a storm on the horizon, began to gather. Their weapons, sharp as vengeance itself, were forged in the heat of betrayal and loss. This was not a raid for treasure. This was a call for destruction, for the total annihilation of those who dared to insult the sons of Ragnar. And at the head of this army, there was not the brute strength of Bjorn or the quiet stoicism of Sigurd. There was Ivar, the boneless dot. Ivar, the cold, calculating mind behind this massive wave of destruction. Ivar, who saw not with the eyes of rage, but with the eyes of a strategist, a puppet master pulling the strings. It was Ivar who understood the true cost of Ragnar's death. He knew that to truly defeat King Allel of Northumbria, the man who had humiliated his father, he had to do more than fight. He had to break them, slowly, methodically, and with a cruelty that would haunt them for generations. Ivar knew that Northumbria's strength lay not in the size of its armies, but in its stone fortress. The Vikings could not defeat such a stronghold through a direct assault. No, Ivar had a plan, far more insidious. His first move wasn't to march north. It wasn't to attack Ella directly. Instead, he landed in East Anglia, bypassing his true target. The locals were confused, but soon their fear turned to submission. Ivar demanded horses from them, transforming his Viking fleet into a mounted cavalry. He spent the winter in East Anglia, sharpening his blades and feeding off the terror he instilled. The anticipation of his move was worse than any pain. He knew that fear, when left to fester, would turn into something far more deadly. It would become a force that would tear down even the strongest walls. By the spring of 866 AD, the great heathen army was ready. They weren't just a band of angry raiders anymore. They were a professional war machine, and under Ivar's command, they turned their eyes north. But they wouldn't strike yet. No, Ivar had other plans. His brothers, eager for vengeance, wanted to attack immediately. But Ivar knew better. He had learned patience. And so, The great heathen army waited. They moved slowly, like a creeping shadow, and when they did strike, it was not in haste. It was with a purpose. It was when the people of Northumbria had let their guard down. It was when they had allowed the smallest crack in their defenses to form. And so, it was in the dead of winter, with the promise of a spring thaw, that Ivar led his army to their final destination. They would breach the walls of York, but not just in any way. They would strike during a time of peace, a time of divine protection. They would strike when the Northumbrians were most vulnerable. The date was set, November 1st. All Saints' Day. The men of York noblemen, bishops, and soldiers alike gathered in their cathedrals, unarmed, ready to give thanks for their divine protection. They had no reason to fear. They had no reason to suspect that their kingdom's doom was just beyond their gates. But when the bells rang, it wasn't the sound of victory. It was the sound of death. The gates of York fell before the first hymn was even finished. Ivar had waited for this moment. His strategy had worked. The streets of York were flooded with Viking warriors. But there was no battle. There was no honor. This was a massacre. It was an execution of the spirit, an obliteration of everything the Northumbrians believed they had protected. As the blood of York soaked into the earth, the Vikings did not celebrate. Their victory had come too icily, too cruelly. Ivar the Boneless, the mastermind behind it all, was not a man of honor. He was a man of calculation, of cold strategy. The massacre in York was not the culmination of his revenge, it was only the beginning. For Ivar, the true punishment lay not in death, but in forcing his enemies to endure the slow agony of watching everything they held dear crumble. When the Northumbrians broke through the gates and flooded into the streets, they thought they had won. Their cheers rang out, their swords raised high, convinced that the Vikings had been defeated, that the war had ended. But they had walked straight into a trap. Ivar knew what would happen next. He had left the city's defenses weak, knowing full well that the English would push forward, desperate for victory, blinded by the narrow streets and crowded alleyways. And then the walls snapped shut. The Vikings poured from every rooftop, every darkened corner, and the streets of York transformed into a blood-drenched battleground. The Northumbrians, packed tightly together, were trapped like rats in a cage. Their numbers, once their strength, became their weakness. They couldn't swing their weapons. They couldn't escape. The air filled with screams as Viking axes cut through armor and flesh alike. King Osbert, the rightful heir to Northumbria's throne, fought valiantly, but his courage was no match for the savage precision of Ivar's army. He was cut down, his body trampled beneath the heels of those who had once called him their leader. Yet, amid the carnage, one man's life was spared. It wasn't out of mercy nor compassion. It was because Ivar had a single, final task to complete. King Alella, the man who had caused the death of Ragnar Lothbrok, was still alive, but surrounded. He was trapped, his armies decimated, his kingdom in ruins. Ivar knew that this was the moment. This was the culmination of years of planning, of waiting, of suffering. Allah tried to escape, but it was futile. He was dragged from his horse, his armor torn, his crown long forgotten, and forced to his knees. His pleas, if he even had any left, would go unheard. The Viking gods had already made their judgment. He had killed Ragnar, but he had made a grave mistake. He had underestimated the vengeance of Ragnar's sons. The Great Hall of York had witnessed countless kings, yet never before had it been the site of such a brutal and horrific scene. Alel, the once proud king, was now nothing more than a prisoner, his fate sealed. The sons of Ragnar watched from their seats. Bjorn, Ironside, cold and unyielding, looked at the king with the detached gaze of a butcher sizing up a side of meat. Sigurd Snake and I, silent and unblinking, watched with the same intensity that had driven him to carve through his own flesh. But it was Ivar the Boneless, the mastermind who cast the darkest shadow in the room. He spoke not with anger or hatred, but with an unsettling calmness. He asked Allah to relive his crime. He forced him to remember how Ragnar had died, how he had been humiliated by being thrown into the pit of vipers. Every question was a twist of the knife, a reminder of the depths of the insult. Alela, broken and humiliated, finally saw the true face of vengeance. The sons of Ragnar, in the eyes of their father's killer, were not mere piglets, as Ragnar had predicted in his final breaths. No, they were wolves, relentless, cunning, and hungry for blood. They would not let him die swiftly. A quick death would have been mercy, but there would be no mercy for Alela, and so, on that cold Northumbrian hillside, the blood eagle was prepared. Ivar had orchestrated this moment with chilling precision. The ritual of the blood eagle was one of the most terrifying forms of execution ever known to man. Allah's body was stretched to its limit, his hands and feet staked to the earth. He was no longer a king. He was a canvas for Ivar's twisted art, the executioner. Either Ivar himself or a chosen specialist approached with a long knife. The first cut was slow, deliberate. The skin along Allah's back was torn open, revealing the raw muscle beneath. The bones of his ribs, once a source of strength and protection, were severed one by one, and with each crack, a horrible sound echoed through the silence of the hills. The ribs were spread wide, like the wings of an eagle, the symbol of Viking might. But the ritual did not end there. The executioner reached into Allah's chest, pulling out the lungs and draped them over the broken ribs. As the lungs fluttered in their final, desperate gasps, they looked like the wings of a bird and eagle, struggling to fly, but failing. Trapped in a dying man's body, Ella screamed. His body convulsed in agony, but no mercy would come. He had chosen this fate when he killed Ragnar. He had sealed his own doom with his cruel act of betrayal. As Allah's life drained away, the sons of Ragnar stood in silence, watching. There was no joy in this death, no celebration, only the cold satisfaction of justice and the knowledge that Ragnar had been avenged. But the toll of war was heavy, and even the victors felt the weight of it. With Allah's death, the Vikings left a brutal message to all of England. There was no mercy, no negotiation, no surrender. The great heathen army would not stop until they had claimed everything that Ragnar had lost. But there was another king who stood in their way, in the kingdom of East Anglia. The Vikings found their next target. King Edmund had been foolish enough to believe that he could buy his way out of the Vikings' wrath, offering them horses in exchange for peace. He thought that if he gave them what they wanted, he could save his kingdom. But the Vikings, led by Ivar, were not men who could be bargained with. Ivar's code was simple. Submission was not an option. When the Vikings returned to East Anglia, they did not ask for horses. They demanded the kingdom. King Edmund, a man of deep faith, refused to bow to pagan overlords. His faith in Christ was unwavering, even in the face of death. He knew that he could not defeat the Vikings in battle, but he also knew that he would not give in to them. He chose to fight, even though he knew it would cost him his life. Captured by Ivar's army, Edmund was tied to a tree. The Vikings didn't execute him immediately. Instead, they let him suffer. They rained arrows down upon him, each one piercing his body, not to kill him, but to break him. They aimed not for the heart, but for the limbs, the shoulders, the arms. Edmund's body became a pincushion, his flesh filled with arrows, yet his faith never wavered. Through it all, Edmund cried out to Christ, but his cries were not answered. Eventually, Ivar grew bored with the game. His patience ran thin. With a final order, a swordsman approached and severed Edmund's head with a single blow. His body, punctured and broken, was left where it fell pinned to the tree. A martyr's death in the face of Viking domination. The aftermath, the fall of Edmund, marked another victory for the Viking army. By 874 AD, the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia had fallen. Only one kingdom remained, Wessex. But in Wessex, the sons of Ragnar would find something they had not encountered before. A king not driven by fear nor rage, but by intellect. Alfred, he would rise from the ashes of his broken kingdom, not as a warrior, but as a visionary. The story of the sons of Ragnar was not finished. The war for England was just beginning. The haunting tale of Ivar's legacy and the destruction of kingdoms continues in the shadows of history. And though the blood has long since dried, the scars on the land and on the hearts of those who lived through it remain.